how to get the look of a cottage garden in a small city space right after this. Over the past 20 years as a garden designer, I've enjoyed helping homeowners create private sanctuaries full of beauty and wonder. I find each garden to be a fresh opportunity to explore ways to create uniquely personal spaces. These are just a few of the gardens I've helped to transform into garden homes. Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Welcome to the Garden Home, where you'll find practical ideas, beautiful landscapes, and much, much more to help inspire you to push the boundaries of your home right out into the garden, to the edges of your property. Now, in today's show, we're going to explore the cottage garden and how this style can fit in any size space, even small city spaces. Now, the whole idea behind the cottage garden is to pack a variety of materials, all beautiful, into one small area. Now, springboarding off this idea, throughout the show, I'll be showing you how to create a beautiful cornucopia that you can fill with the harvest that you'll take from your own garden. When I design a garden, whether it's large or small, I always fall back on my 12 principles of design. It's kind of a garden designer's checklist, if you will. Now, we don't have time to cover all 12 of those principles in today's show, but we'll focus on a few that will allow you to take a small space and make it feel larger and more expansive. The first principle we'll cover is color. Now, what I like about color is it gives us an opportunity to have some fun in the garden. I approach it as a painter would, applying paint on a canvas. That's what I keep in mind as I walk through a garden center or nursery full of bright, vivid blooms. But sometimes the sight of all these plants can be a little overwhelming. You wonder which ones to buy and how many to get. So by the end of today's show, I hope that you'll be able to walk through a nursery with confidence and pick out plants that'll be just right for your cottage garden. Another principle, which is made up of three ideas I've sort of lumped together, texture, pattern, and rhythm, works hand in hand with color. You see, visual rhythm in a garden is just as important as the rhythm that we hear in music. Let me give you an example of rhythm. Here's a series of containers that are just lined up. Now, it's important to understand that you have to have at least three of the same elements to get the beat going. Now on to texture and pattern. You see, when these elements are used effectively in the garden, they can create the look of tapestries or richly patterned quilts. See how this drift of blooms and foliage weaves a beautiful design. Now, the last principle we'll talk about is time. And what I mean by that is the age or the implied age of an object in a garden or even a garden itself. Here's a good example. When you look at this home, you naturally assume it's old. And that's exactly what the owners set out to accomplish when they built this house. They wanted an authentic-looking New England salt box, and they truly achieved it. Not only is the home's exterior authentically reproduced, but also the gardens surrounding the home are full of plants that may have been found in 18th century gardens. It's a beautiful cottage garden that's set off by a home that truly evokes the feeling of time and place. Time isn't limited to just structures. It can also refer to plants and the way they change over the seasons. A mossy path that evokes a feeling of age, even garden ornament. When you combine color, pattern, texture, and rhythm, and time, along with my other 12 principles of design, you're guaranteed success. Now, throughout the show, I'm going to refer to several terms. One is garden home and the other is garden room, and they all work together. You see, I discovered this idea of the garden home when I was a student of garden history and design in England. I went to these wonderful gardens, many of them quite grand, but what they had in common was a series of garden rooms that often surrounded the house. The collection of rooms made up a garden home. Now, this concept really stuck with me, and when I came home, I created a garden home for myself. Now, the idea really is very practical, because for me, dividing spaces into more manageable areas just makes a lot of sense. And you can also develop each space in ways that reflect different personalities or styles. Of course, the greatest thing about a garden home is that you have all this expanded living space. Now, let's take a look at color. When I said color, I'm sure that immediately a picture like this probably came to mind. a field packed full of beautiful blooms. These are ranunculus flowers at the flower fields in Carlsbad, California. Each one of these plants is slightly different, even within the same color. You see, some have peony-shaped blooms, while others are more daisy-like, but all equally beautiful. When I visit sites like this, I'm always reminded that nature is quite an amazing artist, constantly creating masterpieces large and small. But you know, color in our gardens doesn't have to come from flowers alone. For the past several years, I've become increasingly interested in the foliage of plants. Here's an old-fashioned favorite that's experiencing a resurgence in popularity: Coleus. Each spring, when I begin to add that extra splash of color with annuals in my garden, I always try to think beyond the bloom of a plant and really concentrate on its foliage. You see, there's a whole world of color that you can find in the leaves of a plant. Take this Coleus, for example. Each leaf is a work of art. Just look at its deep maroon color. Its ruffled edges almost make it look like velvet. You know, I'm amazed by the variety of Coleus available to us today. They offer such a kaleidoscope of color. You know, I use them in containers and also in my flower beds, those that get partial sun as well as full sun. What I like about using these dark, rich colors is that it adds a lot of depth to my flower borders. Last year, I planted a Coleus that was similar in color, and it added visual interest in these flower beds right up until the first hard frost. Now, don't be deceived by these small plants. Once the summer heat rolls in, they'll really take off. I recently discovered a series of Coleus varieties that I think are knockouts in the garden. It's the stained glass works. You see, you're looking at one called Fright Night. Isn't that a great name for such a colorful plant? And look at those interesting leaves. Now here's one of my favorites, Tilt-a-whirl. The fan-like leaves make it look like something other than a Coleus. And just look at the rich colors ranging from pink to salmon. These look great planted with globe amaranth. And if you're looking for a really deep, richly colored Coleus, you should try Trailing Rose. It nearly took over the corner of my front garden this summer. For more on creating a colorful garden that takes advantage of foliage plants, I visited with Kathy Pufall of Beds and Borders in Laurel, New York. Kathy's regarded as a color expert, and she's put together some beautiful display gardens. Let's take a look. Kathy, it's the flower or the bloom that really dazzles us, but it's the foliage of the plants that really help hold the garden together.
I think so. I design with foliage first when I do a container or the border. I think there's as much interest in foliage as there is in flowers. You've got different colors, different shapes. I find that the foliage holds the border together even when the flowers come in and out of bloom.
Well, this is like a big laboratory or studio for a painter where you're creating different color combinations and experimenting all the time.
Absolutely, and it also gives us an opportunity to show our customers and any of the public that comes to visit us what the mature size of these plants are. They don't often look like so much in a 4-inch pot in May,
right.
But to imagine
Give
that
them
a little
full growing season and look what you have.
and they bloom long into the fall, and we have a beautiful season with these flowering plants. It can just be in color the whole season and accent perhaps a perennial border. I don't know that it's practical for a home gardener to plant annuals this densely, but they can certainly take a segment of a combination that they really like and use that in their own perennial border to enhance summer color.
Right. Pick your favorite color theme, and here you have a beautiful combination to work from. Kathy, do you find that visitors to Beds and Borders this time of year particularly are amazed at the amount of color you can have in your garden?
Oh, absolutely. That's our main motivation for putting these gardens in, is to show people how much color we can have. Even in August, I find that so many home gardens are really deprived of color in August, and there's no need for that. With the proper plant selection, fertilization, and watering, the garden can look beautiful, certainly for us, until mid-November.
Well, I mean, these displays are a real testament to the use of texture and foliage color along with bloom.
Absolutely, because the foliage can hold the garden together even when flowers are coming in and out of bloom.
As you can see, Kathy combines color in a masterful way. Now, the color choices that you make often reflect the style of the garden you're creating. More formal or sophisticated garden schemes may require more coordinated color palettes, like a monochromatic color scheme, for instance. Cottage gardens, on the other hand, by their very nature, can be just a mixture of colors. Anything goes. Many of the plants that we just saw at Kathy's can apply in the flower garden or in containers. Let's take a look at a container that combines both flower and foliage beautifully, and it's perfect for full sun. It all starts with a simple recipe. That's something tall and spiky in the center, a round and full element in the middle of the container, and to finish it off, some cascading plants that will spill over the edge. Since this container is designed for full sun, I'm focusing on contrasting colors, purples and yellows. For the tall and spiky element, I've used a foliage plant called Dracaena, or it's often called a spike. Now remember that if a container is going to be placed against a wall, this tall spiky element should be planted toward the back. If it's going to be viewed from all sides, just place it in the middle of the container. Dracaena is ideal for a composition that will be viewed from all sides because of its pointed leaves and symmetrical shape. Now the round and full plants include bold leaf Persian shield, straw flowers called golden buttons, and helichrysum dwarf silver. Cascading plants have a way of relaxing a composition and add so much to soften the container. Here I've used Petunia's Blue Storm to bridge the gap between round and full and cascading plants. A lantana called New Gold and Scaevola sapphira completes the composition. No matter the size of your garden, there's no reason why it shouldn't be full of life and color, particularly given the myriad of plants we have to choose from today. Right now I'm putting together a cornucopia to fill with autumn's bounty. This is a really simple project. Let me show you how to put one together. I've used a 2-foot by 2-foot piece of chicken wire, 1-inch mesh, and rolled it into a cone. Now I'm just going to fasten it together by bending the tines over like this. Next, I just roll back the mouth of the cornucopia to create somewhat of a collar or a lip. And then at the other end, I begin to twist the cone and give it a slight curl for that classic cornucopia shape. All right, now with the frame complete, I'm ready to apply the sheet moss. Now, this can be bought at your local florist or hobby store, and I apply it with some hot glue just by putting it on the back side of the moss like so, and then I start up here at the mouth of the cornucopia and work myself back toward the tail, if you will. Now, when you're finished, it will look like this. Now, you can see I've taken some grapevine and twisted it around to follow the shape of the cornucopia. This also helps keep the moss in place. Now in just a little bit, I'm going to fill this horn of plenty with autumn's bounty. But first, let's take a look at some great examples of how the winter garden can be filled with color, with a visit to the New York Botanical Garden. Now you might expect New York in December to be bleak, but a walk around the Botanical Garden reveals some sights you might not expect in the midst of winter. Todd Forrest, who specializes in trees at the garden, shows us around. Most of us usually don't think of visiting a botanical garden in the winter, but it's actually one of the best times to see sea plants.
It's actually my favorite time of year here in the garden because there are so many things that you don't think of as beautiful that are really at their best. Plants with berries, plants with great bark.
There's actually a lot of color in the winter.
Great color. Berry plants in particular, hollies and viburnum and andina, and other plants with wonderful bark.
Well, I was knocked out by that deciduous holly at the entry coming in today.
It's got fantastic bright red berries, and it really just takes off in the winter. It looks great.
Of course, the color of berries just doesn't stop with red. There are purple and yellow berries as well.
One of the most spectacular purple berried plants is beautyberry, calicarpa, and it has a very unnatural, almost electric color purple, and this time of year it really just glows.
And then, of course, there are barks.
We have some of my favorite plants are really grown for their barks, or at least are most spectacular when their bark is prominent as it is in the winter, including paperbark maple, Tanyosho pine, and lacebark pine, all wonderful bark plants.
And then the maples themselves offer a wide range of bark color and texture.
Exactly. There is Sangukaku, which is a cultivar of Japanese maple, has a sort of coral colored bark.
Oh yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Spectacular in the winter.
Brilliant color.
And it's they really brighten up a gray day. They're almost best to be seen when it's sort of overcast and chilly.
And then, of course, the red twig and yellow twig dogwood.
Again, those are sort of some of our hardest working horticultural plants. They're great both in formal gardens and in naturalistic plantings.
Now, if you're inspired to add some winter color to your garden, you might consider trying Helleborus, winter jasmine, or the fragrant winter honeysuckle. Or for warmer parts of the country, you might try camellias or mahonia, sometimes known as grape holly. They're great additions to the garden during the cold, bleak months. Seeing gardens in winter reminds me of yet another element of design, and that's time. Earlier in the show, I used as an example this beautiful 18th century style New England salt box. While it's relatively new, it has the look and feel of an old home. My garden was designed to reflect the time from when the house was constructed, which was around the turn of the century. The arbors in the fountain garden reflect the style of the front porch. And I've even planted roses that reflect the same period of the house, which is around the turn of the century. This is Frau Karl Druski, which was introduced around 1901, and she blooms from spring until fall. I mentioned that time also applies to plants and how they change throughout the seasons. Let's take a look at another example from my garden. One of the most exciting times of the year for me in my garden is the spring. It's a time of year when all the flowers begin to unfold, and it's a time I can appreciate all of the hard work and planning I've put into my garden's design. You see, it's important for me to get the timing and varieties of plants right, so I have a continuous sequence of bloom. For instance, my tulips are just finishing up, but these crabapples are in full glorious bloom. I can't imagine my garden without these beautiful small ornamental trees. Each season they provide so much beauty. In the spring they're covered in these white blossoms, and in the summer, well, they have beautiful shiny green leaves. For the fall they're awash in golden foliage, and in the winter they're covered with these tiny crabapples, which serve as food for the birds. 20 years ago I would have never dreamed of planting a crabapple tree in my garden. You see, they had developed such a reputation, justifiably, of being messy and prone to disease that you never would want one around. But thanks to work being done by places like the National Arboretum, new introductions of crabapples are now available to us. Improved cultivars of crabapple, such as this one called Narragansett, don't have the problems the old varieties had. I love contrasting foliage forms to show texture in the garden. A broadleaf plant like Hosta crassa regal next to the fine feathery texture of ferns such as Japanese painted ferns is just one example. I create patterns in the garden by planting drifts of color. Beds of tulips in the same color or color family grab the eye. If you think about it, this is what's so attractive about seeing fields of flowers grown commercially. There are rows upon rows of flowers repeated over and over, creating a pattern that the eye can follow. Texture and pattern can also be expressed through stonework or architecture. At the Chicago Botanic Garden, this courtyard houses a Japanese-inspired stream made from different sized stones. Even though the rocks are stationary, you feel as though you're looking at movement. Which leads us to rhythm in the garden. You see, rhythm can be established quite simply by using plants like boxwoods or trees planted in interesting patterns. Often I think that rhythm affects us in a subtle way, almost on an unconscious level. Let me give you an example. These are pleached lime trees at Chatsworth House in England. The long lines of trees, one after another, creates a pattern or rhythm that leads the eye up to the house. It's a hedge on stilts, you might say. In my own garden, I've created a sense of rhythm with 4 beds surrounding the grassy oval in my rondelle garden. The clipped boxwoods complete the circuit around this garden and also serve as a backdrop for plants growing in the flower beds. Another example is containers placed in a series or a row. These urns add a nice architectural element to help punctuate the magnificent view of the Chicago skyline beyond. You know, there are so many opportunities for us to use texture, pattern, and rhythm in the garden. Well, I've used it here at this entry into my side garden. Now, this project involved using some river rock, flat stones, and brick. I know it looks complicated, but it really is a simple project. Let me take you through the steps and demystify the process. I started by digging out an area. For this entry, I made it about 4 feet wide and about 6 inches deep. Then I used 2x4 lumber around the edges. This will hold the concrete in place. Once you have the concrete in place, just grade it out until it's level. For this 6-inch deep area, I only poured about 3 inches of concrete to form the foundation. Now once this dries, it leaves room for the stones, rocks, and bricks to sit flush with the ground once the pad is complete. After I allowed the concrete to sit overnight, I placed the stones in a pattern and used a special grout mix to secure them into place. Next to follow are the bricks. Here I grouted them into place. Now I'm going to let these elements sit overnight before adding the river rocks. From here I just filled in the remaining space with river rocks and grouted them in with that special grout mix and let them set up to dry. This design always draws a lot of attention from visitors to my garden. But if you want to put in something like this, you need to make sure you have plenty of time. This project takes about 3 days, so it's perfect for a long weekend. Now back to this idea of the cottage garden. One of the finest examples of this style that I've seen in America is in the English walled garden at the Chicago Botanical Garden. They've devoted a whole section of this garden to teaching people how to bring elements of a cottage garden into their own homes. John Beaudry with the Chicago Botanical Garden shows us how this garden is laid out. John, this garden is so beautiful. It has to be one of the most popular gardens here at the Chicago Botanic Garden.
People seem to be able to relate to this garden.
Really? And why do you think so?
Well, its small and intimate spaces provide a way for people to interact with it as they would in their own gardens.
Well, you know, John, over the years I've had an opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in English gardens, and I have to say this one really hits the mark.
The whole garden is a series of walls and rooms that are broken up by different spaces, but throughout you have a sense of that there's something beyond, and it draws one through the garden and into the next space.
Yes, a little mystery.
Yes.
Helps a lot, doesn't it? Now, where are we going here?
Here we're coming into the beginning of the cottage garden, and this is where you'll find one of the more unique features of the garden. Here the paths begin to shift, and one is slowed down as they move through the garden, and you're able to have a little closer inspection of the plants. The plants are completely informally planted, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of all kinds of things, from fruits and vegetables to flowers of all sorts, especially aromatic and fragrant ones, a lot of herbs.
Right.
People had little amount of space, and they needed to grow everything that they could, and people often lived out of their gardens in those days.
Well, John, tell me a little bit more about this garden.
This garden, the concept of it is to mimic a traditional cottage garden, and as you can see, it's already billowing over the edges, and when the plants that we've planted literally hundreds in here today with the volunteers, and when they come up, this is just going to be overflowing. The crisp lines of the walkways in here, which are part of the structure of the garden, are completely obliterated by the plants, which is really the concept of the garden overall.
It's truly a potpourri.
Yeah, and it's a focus on nature and a focus on the plants, and the structure is here to enhance those plantings.
Since the cottage garden is all about mixing everything up, vegetables, herbs, and flowers, and with great bounty, I thought we'd go ahead and finish this cornucopia. Now this is going to be a door hanging, and since it's an autumnal theme, I'm going to fill it with all sorts of things, like mums, wheat, pumpkins and gourds, cabbage and kale, as well as anything dried that might have come out of the garden. Now, when it comes to live plants, what I do in order to reduce the weight and save space is just take the plants out of a container like this and slip them into a plastic bag. Then you can just tuck them in the cornucopia. Earlier, I placed some floral foam into the cornucopia. You see, I use this to help secure the pumpkins and squash. I just pierce them with a floral stake and then secure them into the foam. Fill it up with dried flowers, and there you go. What I enjoy the most about this project is that it really echoes the spirit of the season, full of so much bounty, color, and beauty. There's no better way when this is finished to greet guests coming to your front door. Well, we've covered a lot of territory in today's show. Everything from color to time to pattern, texture, and rhythm. All of these elements play a role in the cottage-style garden. And if you decide you want to create this style for yourself, I hope you'll put some of these ideas to work. From the Garden Home, I'm Alan Smith. More information about today's topic and other topics covered in this series can be found at pallansmith.com.
On an upcoming episode of P. Alan Smith's Garden Home.
Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Can you ever have too much in the garden? Well, you won't think so after you see this show on abundance. We'll visit wildflower fields in Texas, see North American natives blooming in a Dutch garden, see how historical gardens were influenced by European style, and how American designers are creating a style all their own.